We're in John 19. We only got 2 more chapters left. Half of the book of John, as we talked before, is just the last week of his life. And so this has been the whole focus. So then we had the private times when he was speaking with the disciples in the upper room. And then as they're walking down into the Garden of Gethsemane, he was teaching them about I am the vine, you are the branches. And now he has been delivered up and he has been tried. And now he's in front of Pontius Pilate, who is the procurator or the governor of the province, which Israel was part of in the Roman Empire. And there's only one disciple that's with him at this point, at the foot of the cross, and that's John. It's John and 4 women were the only ones left. Everybody else had fled. Now, early church fathers connect the sacrifice of Jesus to the sacrifice of Isaac. And I think this is a really interesting correlation to put together. Genesis 22 is the first time in the scriptures that the word love is used. And it is the love of a father preparing to sacrifice his son on Mount Moriah. Okay. And that's in Genesis 22 is when he called Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac, the son that you love, to offer up to God in Genesis 22. That's the first time the word love was used. And it was on Mount Moriah. But then, Jesus, then the Lord stopped him from doing it. So I have provided the ram. I provided the sacrifice. If you go read that sometime in Genesis 22. But that's all a foreshadowing of what Christ did. A lot of people don't realize this, but Mount Moriah is Jerusalem. It is the Temple Mount. It is really at the highest peak, which is where we'd be at in Golgotha, with the place of the skull. So where Jesus died on the cross was on Mount Moriah. What the Father was asking for the correlation of with Isaac was the fact that, and that's the first time the word love was, and then we know here, God so loved the world he gave his only begotten son. And so this is a mirror of all that was done there. It's the same hill where Jesus died. Mount Moriah is Mount Calvary. The very top is called Golgotha, the place of the skull. Here's what's interesting about this is, well, the cross was not an unplanned event. It was foreshadowed, as we see in Genesis 22. So this has always been God's plan. This is not something that happened because Jesus said the wrong thing. This was planned from the very beginning. Jesus is not a victim. This is what brings his victory. So let's go to verse 1 of chapter 19. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Now that word flog means to whip. And they would have what's called a cat of nine tails, with leather strips, with little pieces of sheep bone and metal that were tied or attached to the end of the leather strips. And there are 3 levels of flogging that Romans would do. And if you look at the language of why Pilate was disturbed, because what he originally wanted done was the first level, which was called fustigatio. Level 1, it's a scourging, a light punishment to appease the crowd, because you don't really think the guy is guilty, but we're going to punish him so you'll back off and leave. And that's what he was wanting to be done for Jesus. But there's 3 other levels. There is flagellatio, which is brutal. That is, it's brief. It's like, only a handful of lashes, but they are brutal. That is to punish you. Then there's verberatio, which is reserved for capital punishment. So here is what some of the commentaries were on this. Was he told that he ordered for Jesus to be flogged, and they had heard that he was being accused of treason. But what we'll see here is Pilate said 3 times, this man is not guilty. But some of the conjectures are, but people had heard that he had what was for treason for saying he was king, and so the Roman soldiers automatically assumed it was a capital crime because treason is a capital crime in the Roman government. So they gave him the worst scourging, which is not what Pilate wanted done. And so we'll get to that here in a minute. So that was very interesting. Seems like, oh, that was just, coincidence, poor luck. No, God is in charge of this whole thing all the way through, even the miscommunications of what was being said here. So that third level for capital crimes is so severe that it was known to expose the internal organs. It would remove most of the flesh. So you'd see the rib cage and you would be seeing the internal organs. Not to try to get gross here, but I'm trying to help you understand the picture of how severe it was. And even that was a miracle that he was able to get to Golgotha. And the reason they would flog them was to weaken them so that in a twisted way, seen as mercy, where they would die faster. So verse 2, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. Now, here's what's interesting when you dig into these things. Crown of thorns was symbolic of the curse that happened in the Garden of Eden. Thorns grew over things, and so that was from the curse of the land. And now he bears that curse to take it away. But it's also a mockery of his kingship. Again, the treason aspect. But also is foreshadowing his death. When they would rip that robe off, it would reopen the wounds all over again. And they would mock him. They would come up to him. They'd say, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they'd strike him with their hands. Now, this was actually a game that they did all the time with criminals, with those that were in custody. They call it the hot hand because they had been so brutalized, they couldn't see because their eyes were probably swollen shut, is hit them and who hit you. It was a way of mocking them because they could not see what was being done. And so then in verse 4, Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So he's already said, this guy's not guilty. Now, what you see if you read the other 3 Gospels is he sent him to King Herod to try to pawn it off to him. But then King Herod just sent him on back to him. Everybody was playing hot potato with him at that point. And so he's back. If you ever saw The Passion of the Christ, they illustrate that one pretty well. But he said, "I find no guilt in him." But then check this out. Because Pilate at that time was trying to set him free. Pilate's wife had a dream. Don't mess with this guy. And you're going to see some of these pictures here in a minute. But verse 5, so Jesus came out after that capital punishment scourging, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, "Ecce homo," which meant, "Behold the man." That was actually a statement of shock. He was shocked at how badly beaten he was because he was expecting the light whipping. And then he gets a man who's barely alive. So that's why he's saying, "Ecce homo," behold the man. And this is a prediction. This is a messianic prophecy fulfilled out of Isaiah 53. So a lot of fulfilled prophecy in this whole passage. Now, verse 6, when the chief priest, I find it very interesting, just a side note. And I'm going. I just feel led to pray right now because this is such an intense thing that we started this Bible study last April, and without planning it, we're at this passage on Resurrection Day. And so I see that as a big exclamation mark. So, Lord, I just pray that you'd help us really receive the gravity of what's being displayed in front of us through these verses. So we can celebrate what you've done, and we can be grateful for what you went through, simply for you to restore intimacy between you and us. Thank you, Lord. So this prediction of Isaiah 53. Verse 6, when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, crucify him, crucify him. Seeing how badly beaten he was, gave them extra emphasis on let's get this thing done. We're this close. And there's something else I'll explain here in a minute why it was so urgent. Well, I'll give you just a quick picture. There were 2 Sabbaths during a feast. You had the normal Sabbath, which would have been Saturday. Then there's a high Sabbath, which was on Thursday. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details of the Holy Week because I don't want to muddy the waters. But let's just say that the one thing I want to say here, because I don't want to do a debate on some Christian doctrine, but there was an urgency for them to have him crucified because they could not have him or any Jewish citizen still being murdered on the Sabbath. And so they needed this done quickly. They said, crucify, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no guilt in him. And then it goes any further. In verse 7, the Jews answered him and said, we have a law. And according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. So right here, when people want to say Jesus just said he's a prophet or he is just a really powerful teacher, he doesn't give you any squirm room. They're right on. And they're revealing their motive here. But they are saying, we have witness. He said, I am at the right hand of the Father, that he is God. People say, well, he said he's the Son of God. Well, that is blasphemous in the Jewish faith as the way they understood it through their Talmud, not through the Torah, but through the Talmud. And the Son of God would be somebody who's God. The divinity was something they could not deny. They are revealing their motive here. They want to kill him because he claims he is the Son of God. You can look in Leviticus 24. It says, someone blasphemes. If you're not receiving them as the Messiah, you are to stone him, was their law. This solidifies Jesus' claim to be deity. The Son of God is God. It's a term of deity used in the Old Testament. Now, when Pilate heard this, verse 8, he was even more afraid. And it's because of his wife's prophecy and because they actually had traditions or superstitions, I guess, that people could be a representation of divine being in ancient traditions. And so he saw that at that moment, he is the Son of God. He just tortured a divine being, remembering his wife's dream. So he was shaken and he was shocked. And with this, Pilate went to Jesus. He entered his headquarters, which was the Praetorium was lifted up so they could oversee the entire Temple Mount, so they could make sure riots would take place. That's his biggest concern, is to make sure a riot would not take place. So he goes back to Jesus after all this. He's going, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you, and I have the authority to crucify you? And Jesus answered him and said, you would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. And this brings up the questions, which we have a verse later on in the epistles where it talks about submitting to the authority over you. Are leaders put in position by God? Yes. Pilate was put here by God. In verse 12, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Chief priests are manipulating Pilate here to force his hand. Pilate was on thin ice because, again, this is going to show you the pressure he was under. I did some digging in history on Pilate. He ruled for 5 years, and he made massive errors throughout the past. He did 3 of them. The first was he came in when he first took over the province. He didn't live in Jerusalem near the Temple Mount, the Praetorium. He would have to come in for the feast. He actually lived near the ocean, near the coast, because it was a lot nicer there. And he only came in for feasts. But he ruled for 5 years. But when he came in, not having done his research, he came in with a graven image of Caesar. And just that created a riot, because one of the laws, the 10 Commandments, is don't have any graven images. And it caused a riot. And so he got in trouble for that. Jewish leaders offered to kill themselves instead of breaking the law and bow to this graven image. And so he backed off because of this error. He had no idea how devoted they were to this. And that got back to Caesar. The second mistake is Pilate, a couple years later, he took money from the temple treasury to pay for an aqueduct. This created another riot that Caesar heard about. Thirdly, the tribute shields of embossed images of Tiberius Caesar, Pilate was told by Caesar to remove the image because Caesar was aware of their traditions and their devotion, but he steps on his toes again. And so he was on thin ice because basically Caesar was saying, you don't know the people you rule over. And if you mess up again, it's your head I'm going to take. So verse 13, so when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out. He's got to appease this crowd because he cannot have another riot or else he's dead. And so he sat down on the judgment seat in a place called the Stone Pavement. And in Aramaic, it's called Gabbatha. Now, it was the day of preparation of Passover. It's where they were preparing the lambs. He's being ruled right now. They're preparing the lambs for sacrifice. That's what the day of preparation is. He's being prepared for sacrifice on the day of preparation. Fascinating stuff. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. That in of itself is blasphemous on their part. So he delivered them over to them to be crucified. Their hatred caused them to forsake their own convictions of worship. Pilate was at a loss with their fervency for a 4th time, so he had to give in. He had to appease this riot. What's interesting is most of this crowd were the same people that were bringing him in with the palm leaves just that Sunday, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, meaning he was just like a the Maccabees coming in, they wanted a military conqueror, but he came on a donkey, not on a horse, which means I'm coming in peace. And so this is something they missed him on this. Now, there other gospels share about Barabbas and all those, but we don't see that here in John. The voices of the people and the chief priests prevailed. So they took Jesus, verse 17, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic meant Golgotha. I've been there. This is one of the most moving things I've ever experienced. There's a Muslim bus depot right at the base of this mountain. And you can actually see the face of the skull on the side of this hill to this day. I've been there. I saw this all with my own eyes about 20 years ago. And so when I saw the skull and that this was Golgotha, I wept. I'm like, this is undeniable. And there's a road in front of it. And it was a main road headed to Damascus. And all the crucifixions took place here because it was a main road, because they wanted those that were being executed on display to deter others from committing crimes. So this was the place where crucifixions took place. Verse 18. So there they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Here's the thing a lot of people don't realize. If you were the one in the middle, that was called the place of disgrace. That was the most humiliating position. And so you're a thief on either side. Now, you see the pictures of him carrying a cross, like in the Passion of the Christ. Actually, it was just the cross beam, because they would have those stakes already established in the ground. And the cross beam would then be hooked onto those stakes, and then you'd be suspended in the air. So the one in the middle was called the place of disgrace. The weight of that cross beam was anywhere from 75 to 100 pounds. And so having been flogged to the degree he had, he didn't have the strength to complete it. That's why Simon the Cyrene carried it the rest of the way for him. Again, that wasn't shared in the Gospel of John, but it was why he couldn't complete it, because it was so heavy. So in verse 19, Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. And it read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, wait a minute, do not write the King of the Jews, but rather this man said, I am the King of the Jews. And Pilate answered, what I've written, I have written. He's done with it. He's not going to be debating with them anymore. He's appeased them enough. He wrote this the way he did to justify the execution. Because if he said he was the King of Jews, that wasn't treason. Being the King of the Jews is treason. So he wrote this to justify the execution. If he was the King of the Jews, that is treason in the Roman world, which is why the Jewish leaders stated it in the first place. So they tried to manipulate it for him so he would do the execution. And they want to play both sides of the street, but they weren't going to do that. They fought back on this post, saying he said this, but Pilate needed to cover himself to avoid repercussions from Caesar. It's also why it was written in 3 languages, because those are the 3 languages of the province. Remember, Pilate asked him, are you a king? In verse 33. And Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. And Pilate responded, so you are a king. Again, this was to cover his treason, but it's also kind of a spiritual coronation. He's recognizing he was a king, because he was seeing that he might be divine. but he was more afraid of the crowd than of God. And we know he's more than just the King of the Jews. He's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Remember, when he was born, the Magi asked, "Where is the King of the Jews?" Now, going back to the cross, there was actually a seat normally so that they could push up and get a breath, because the main, well, what caused Jesus to die is he had cardiac failure. And we'll show you how that we know that in a minute. But most people would die on the cross. It'd take days, and it would be by suffocation. Because and you put pressure on this. They had the seat where you put your feet on. They nailed your feet to the seat, and that way you could push yourself up in order to get a breath. And that allowed people to be suffering there for days, sometimes weeks. But they had to speed things along here because the high Sabbath of Passover was upon them. So they were asked to break the legs of those that were still alive before sundown, because sundown would be the beginning of the Sabbath. Now, what's interesting here, all Roman citizens were exempt from crucifixion. It was only given to capital crimes and treason by those considered to be slaves or servants. Now, verse 23, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier. Also his tunic, but the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." Another messianic prophecy. They divided my garments among them. And there were 5 pieces in the traditional wearing in Jerusalem at this time. And my clothing they cast lots. That's stated in Psalm 22. God is completely in control. This is all fulfilling messianic prophecies that seem completely happenstance, but they're not. The people at the cross were 4 unbelieving soldiers, 4 believing women, and John. And we see 7 sayings. Not all these are in the Gospel of John, but in the 4 Gospels, there's 7 sayings that Jesus said as he was dying on the cross. First one, very first one, which moved me. Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Second one is what he said to the thief that said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Today you will be with me in paradise. The third one we see in this chapter. God's mercy and compassion is he's caring for his mother and his disciple while he's dying on the cross. He was on the cross from about 9 a.m. till noon. Then darkness covered the land. This is actually stated in history books. Josephus recorded this, that there was darkness and an earthquake taking place on this day. I'm going to come back to the earthquake thing here a little bit, because it damaged the temple and tore the veil between the Ark of the Covenant and exposing it for all. And that veil was like 6 inches thick. So it wasn't like a curtain in your house that would tear. That's 6 inches thick of fabric that tore in two and exposed the Ark of the Covenant. But at this time, when the darkness was over the land, Jesus said nothing. The fourth thing he said, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's what he was weeping over and grieving over in the garden. Not that he was going to go through all this torture, but that he would, for the first time, be separate from the Father because he had to bear our sin. The fifth thing he said, I thirst. He was given sour wine, a mixture of sour wine. The sixth thing he said is, it is finished. The seventh thing he said is, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Now, I'm going to come back to some of those statements here in a minute. So the soldiers did all this. But standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene, three Marys. So that was a pretty ordinary name. Actually, Jesus wasn't, it was Yeshua, which meant Joshua. There was a lot of Joshuas in that time too. So it wasn't a unique name. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, that was John, standing nearby, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. And then he said to this disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. And Mary went and lived with John. She lived there 11 years. She had died 11 years later at the age of 59 years of age in John's home. This is recorded in a lot of the early church writings. No scriptures, but it is a pretty clear thing from the traditions of the early church. So Jesus is showing care for his mother at this point. What's interesting is Jesus' brothers, his bloodline, Mary's sister, none of them took care of her. His disciple John did. Now, after this, Jesus, knowing all was now finished, he said to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. Now, the first time they offered him wine, it was wine mixed with gall. That's not what this is talking about. Gall is like it has a narcotic effect. It's a painkiller. He refused that one because he was drinking the cup of wrath upon himself. So I'm going to fully embrace this. I'm taking on the wrath here. But here he received the wine, sour wine, basically be like cheap wine. You know, it'd be like whatever you know, the cheapest wine you can find. That's what the soldiers would usually drink. He received that wine and then he died. But one other observation is about the hyssop branch. Here's what a lot of people, it blows their mind when they think about it. Hyssop was the branch. You go back in the book of Exodus. This was the branch they used to dip the blood of the lamb onto the doorposts during Passover to keep the angel of death from going into the homes of the Israelite slaves. And it would pass over, the angel of death would pass over their house because they see the blood on the doorpost that was placed there by dipping a hyssop branch into the blood. That's in Exodus 20. You can go look it up. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, It is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. It is finished is one word in Aramaic. Tetelestai. It's one word. And it means I finished what you told me to do. It's paid in full. It is completed. That's really important to see because when people want to live for God, it's really important to recognize if you try to be good to earn God's favor, what you're saying is that what Christ did was not enough. There's nothing you need to add to what he did for you by dying on the cross. It was completely fulfilled. I did what I was told to do. It is completed. Now, since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, this was a very powerful, fulfilled prophecy. They didn't want to have the bodies on there for the Sabbath. And this was the high day, which I could debate with you guys later on what day that was, because I have a differing opinion. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken so they wouldn't be able to breathe and they would suffocate. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first thief and of the other one. who had been crucified alongside Jesus. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. And they did not break his legs, because there is a prophecy that there would be no broken bones. As I said earlier, the body was usually left on the cross for days, but they can't have this up during Sabbath. Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23. His body will not remain on a tree, which was really interesting that it was in the law, because they didn't kill Jewish people by hanging or crucifixion. It was by stoning. But you have a prophecy in Deuteronomy in the law that it will not remain on a tree. Very fascinating stuff. There's a lot of foreshadowing you see in the Old Testament. But one of the soldiers pierced his side, verse 34, with a spear. And at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it had borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, that he also may believe. For these things took place that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. I mentioned that earlier. And again, another scripture, they will look upon him who they have pierced with the spear. This is a messianic prophecy fulfilled as well. Blood and water came out as a sign of death. It's a sign of cardiac failure. The broken heart syndrome is what it's actually called. Literally, it's called the broken heart syndrome for cardiac failure. Now, the reason why he went into minute detail about this in the Gospel of John is there was a Gnostic heresy teaching going around at that time, because Gnosticism was a big issue that Paul was addressing too. But Gnostic heresy believed that being spiritual so pure, you couldn't really be in the flesh. And so Jesus appeared to be on the cross, but he really wasn't. It was like a hologram, because he was so pure, he was spiritual, he couldn't have been in the flesh. And so John was making this point very clear. No, he was very human. And he really did die. So that's why all that details in there was to dismantle the Gnostic heresy of spiritualism. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for the fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he, Joseph of Arimathea, took away his body, and he had early come to Jesus by night, and he came with a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds of spices, which was the tradition. And here's the thing that I shook when I was there. I was there when, sorry, I didn't move the description down here. Hopefully you'll follow along by yourself. So on the other side of the hill of Golgotha is the Garden Tomb. This was purchased by a guy, a British gentleman, in the 1800s. And then this was given over to a trust in Great Britain since then. They still own it. The Garden Tomb, I've been in this tomb. It has a crack right near the door from an earthquake. And it has a slab. And so here's what a lot of people don't realize is when you had a tomb like this, what it would do is you would put a body in the tomb. And then, and there was sometimes room for 7 different bodies. And so it's like a family would have a tomb. And so you could have like 7 different bodies in there, and then they all have different rates of decay. And then you can go in there maybe a year or 2 later, and then you take all the bones and you put them in a little box and move them over so they can make room for other people to be buried in that tomb. So it wasn't like just the tomb for one person, except this was a rich man's tomb. And there was only one place for the body to lay. Joseph of Arimathea was a rich man. I went into this tomb, saw the earthquake crack. Here's what caused me to weep. I was looking at the slab where the body lay, And on one end, it was hewn, it was roughly hewn. Everything else was like pristine, except somebody just haphazardly cut open, kind of carved out a bigger hole where the head would have been, because the body that laid in there was taller than the one that was designed for. It was designed for Joseph of Arimathea, but Christ was laid in there. And this was only built for one body to lay in there. And they had to cut into the stone to make room for his head. That was one of the most profound moments when I saw that. It was pretty intense. And I'm like 99% sure this is the tomb. And it's right there on the other side of the mountain. So they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths and spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and the garden was a new tomb. And that was the other thing, being in that tomb. It was about 2,000 years old. They said this was a brand new tomb. It wasn't built like some of the ones that were the traditions of the time. So again, that was something else that struck me about it. It was a new tomb where no one had yet been laid. Again, going back to how they would, once they would decompose, they'd make room for other bodies to come in. Nobody had ever been in this tomb. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. So that is chapter 19 of John. Any questions or comments on what I just covered? Hi, Paula. Good to see you. Well, I'm grateful for that. I love digging into that stuff to really see the richness of what was taking place and all the messianic prophecies. I tell you, when I was wrestling with before I found Christ, I was trying to prove the Bible false. And one of the things I was trying to show was how you could have manipulated all these messianic prophecies. And I went through every single messianic prophecy that was in the scriptures. And all it did was show me that I was in trouble, because it was reaffirming nobody could have fulfilled all this. Nobody had control over his legs not being broken. Nobody had any control over the piercing. Nobody had any control over being buried in a rich man's tomb. He could not have controlled that. The only thing he could have said is he was a lunatic, but then he still couldn't have arranged all these things to happen. The only thing that is clear to me is that he is who he said he was. And so I'm grateful for what he did for us when he rose from the dead, which we'll talk about next time. And then we'll be closing out that, the last two chapters. So the rest of April will be to finish off John, and then we'll move into Acts. Any comments or questions? Alice?
You were going to talk about the cardiac failure.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
what?
Yeah. It was called the broken heart syndrome, and it's just where the water and the blood have separated because it was failed. And so that broken heart syndrome was a medical term for years, of showing that there was a cardiac arrest. So he didn't die of suffocation. He died from heart failure. So a broken heart, basically, is kind of what's the point of people saying is he had a broken heart because of where the condition was with man. But yeah, so that's what that spear and the separation of the water and blood was pertaining to. Any other questions or comments? So anyway, the messianic prophecies fulfilled there just put me over the edge. I was so grateful for it, as far as surrendering and moving that forward. So on that note, then we'll move on to chapter 20 next time.